Dr. Lee, we are thrilled to have you on the Imagining the Future podcast. I don't think that there's anyone who's going to watch this that won't know who you are, but I always think it's great to turn the introduction over to you. So, Dr. Lee, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. And first, Josh, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here today. My name is Ryan Lee. I am the chair of radiology at Jefferson Einstein. A little bit of background. We're a division of Jefferson Health, and in our division, we have 3 hospitals and several outpatient sites. I would say we've made our name in a niche of the clinical deployment of AI. And so we've collaborated with companies such as RadAI in really coming in early and helping to, I would like to say, co-develop and give feedback and ultimately deploy these innovative things, both in the pixel-based or diagnostic models, but also in the workflow logistic and efficiency-based workflows. So that's what we've been doing the past few years, and I'm very proud of what we've achieved.
Well, Dr. Lee, that's one of the things I want to talk about is I want to get to this reputation that you all have built at Jefferson Einstein of being leaders in AI and the clinical deployment of it. But we'll get there. We got plenty of time. I'd love for you to share what drew you to radiology. I think that's one of the things I've been fascinated with as I talk to radiologists, learning how they found their way into the specialty. So would you mind sharing?
Sure. My road to radiology started pretty early, and I've always been a visual person. But do you want the actual reason why I went into radiology?
I'll take any reason you give me, Ryan.
Okay, because the actual reason is probably not as romantic as you might think. What happened was my mother actually got me a job when I was a senior in high school at our family doctors. And this is an old school family doctor that really doesn't exist too much today. He happened to be essentially a retired surgeon and decided to go into primary care and become a family practitioner. And he had a practice that literally did just about everything. It was a one-stop shop. So he would see patients basically in his office. He would also be able to get their blood cultures, also get their labs. So he actually had a machine, several machines in his office where he draw blood. And I was one of the tech assistants. I would actually take the tube of blood and actually run it and write down the numbers of the RBC and the white blood cells. He was
Wow.
also able to culture. So I would actually culture on a petri dish different things, and he tried different antibiotics, and then the ones that actually panned out, he would actually get. The next thing he would also have was he actually had radiology machines. So he actually had an x-ray right in his office. And so every Wednesday, so we take x-rays all week, and every Wednesday he hired a radiologist to come read. And it was, I distinctly remember, it was every day around 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And so he would always complain about this radiologist, about having to pay this radiologist to come read the films. And I said, oh, that's kind of interesting. I wonder what the big deal is. So, I started hanging out with the radiologist. And I just found that I was actually drawn to it. It was a lot of fun reading the x-rays. And that was my first exposure to radiology. And I always kept that through, even when I was in undergraduate. And I kept that interest through medical school. So that's how I originally got into radiology.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that. I don't think that I have heard that before, so it was illuminating for me. And obviously, you got into radiology. But one of the things I'm interested in, Dr. Lee, is you're the chair at Jefferson Einstein, right? So obviously, you have grown into leadership. What was it about leading either departments or leading your fellow radiologists that really spoke to you?
Well, I've always wanted to make a difference in no matter what I did. And it could be something as simple as helping on my son's baseball teams or the basketball teams. And as a radiologist, we get to help patients. And that's one of the privileges we have. And as a neuroradiologist, for example, in a half day, I may be able to help maybe 20 patients on reading a CTs or MR. As a chair, I'm able to help make policies and protocols for our department, along with my senior leaders, that can affect thousands of patients that we see in a given month. And that may translate to over 400,000 different studies we do in a year. And so I'm able to exponentially help just by virtue of the things that we do to help all those patients. That doesn't in any way diminish the helping of individual patients. And that's why I enjoy doing all of those things. But that's what spoke to me.
Yeah, I think, the way that I think about leadership, Dr. Lee, is you really become a force multiplier, right? In terms of the impact that you have because you're enabling others to impact patient care as well. And clearly you're doing it. And something you said in the introduction that I want to go back to is the reputation that you all have developed at Jefferson Einstein for clinical AI deployment. And I can tell you, this is something that we were talking about before we started the podcast. I can tell you, as I talk to different vendors within radiology, and you ask them, what are the academic medical centers? What are the leadership teams that are really the most innovative, that are really advancing clinical AI, AI that's truly deployed, having an impact right here, right now? They would say Jefferson Einstein. There's not a doubt in my mind. So tell me about how you all developed that. What was it intentional? Was it something that you always wanted to do? I mean, I know people would love to hear about it.
I think it was absolutely intentional. And I give all the credit to the chair that I succeeded, Dr. Terry Madelon. And he always had that forward thinking and is what actually a model that I follow to this day. And so I think one of the things in developing anything, it's not just even in radiology, when you have a basic science team that is able to come up with whatever, in this case, we're talking about models or algorithms and AI, I think there's always a good thing that can develop from the basic science testing. And it looks like it works well in the environment it's in. That, however, may or may not translate into actual real world usage. And that's one of the things that we've done quite a bit of. So while we don't internally develop these models, we're able to help at least translate how it could work in a real world environment. And I think that has a lot of value.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, obviously, I believe that it has a lot of value too. But I would say if you were to look at academic medical centers on a spectrum, and you were to say, hey, this is the academic medical center that really does embrace really working or co-developing, as you mentioned, Dr. Lee, with vendors solutions that they believe are going to have impact, and those that say, hey, listen, we don't have any interest at all, we're not going to do that. It's pretty wide even within radiology, which is the most innovative specialty for physicians in terms of embracing technology. Why do you think some academic medical centers may still be reticent about partnering with vendors, Dr. Lee?
Well, I think it's not just academic medical centers. I think it could be even private practice in any group. I think in general, I think it can be difficult for people to change. And radiology can be practiced in a way that we've done for many years. The ironic thing is that it's hard to change, and for example, in radiology, but at the same time, radiology is a subspecialty that changes not infrequently. When you look at the history of radiology, we went from X-rays to a cross-sectional specialty. And that transformed what radiologists do and what radiologists were able to provide for healthcare. And then you look at how we used to dictate, which was we used to just literally dictate into a cassette and another person would literally listen to it and then transcribe it. And we now go to voice recognition. That was a huge change. And I remember that change. I was a resident fellow when we went through that change, and it was a difficult change for radiologists to adapt to. And then we went to, for example, a film-based specialty where you literally would hang films and read films from that. And now we just use computers on a workstation. And that was a huge watershed event. All these are, and these all happened within the last 30 odd years. And you can see the pace of change in our specialty, I think, dwarfs many other specialties. So it's ironic that on the one hand, it is hard for people to change. And I think that's one reason why it can be hard to get people to move into AI. But on the other hand, it moves very quickly. I think the other thing is there is also a fear of what AI could be. And, we saw that back when Greg Hinton said, hey, stop training radiologists. And we now know, at least for the foreseeable future, if anything, we need more radiologists. So I think it is multifactorial, but I think fear of change can be one of them.
Yeah, no, and Dr. Lee, I appreciate the call out. You're right. It's not just academic medical centers, it's radiology practices, regardless of the setting. I think that there is a reticence for lots of different reasons why they we embrace the change of how AI might help them. But one of the things that I do know that is academic medical center specific is the training of radiologists. So where do you stand on whether or not residents and fellows should be using AI? How do you feel about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. A very hot topic. In fact, I just literally had this discussion with our program director about this for actually impression generation using
Hmm.
Omni. And I'll give you some background. I think that this is always an evolving sort of thought process. I remember about 10, 12 years ago when we transitioned from sort of a free form kind of way of dictating to a template based dictation. So, what I mean by that is if you look at our, say, CT template, it'll say lung base, liver, spleen, kidney, and there are all these little headings, and then the radiologist fill it in. I remember when we went to that, when we told all the attendings, hey, we're going to this template-based thing, no longer free form. The program director at that time said, that's fine, we'll have the attendings do it, but there is no way I'm going to let our residents use the template because they're never going to know how to dictate a good report. And so
Hmm.
for the first couple of years, the residents were not allowed to use those templates.
Huh.
After a few years, it became obvious that templates were going to be the way to go. And the program director said, okay, well, I think we better start making them dictate. This is really the future. In much the same way, I'm seeing AI in a very similar vein. So just taking, for example, the diagnostic AI algorithms. So in other words, the ones that look for fractures, intracranial hemorrhage, et cetera. There's a big discussion on, hey, should we be allowing our residents to be using AI because maybe it'll impact their training? I think it's actually a valid question. But as we move along, I think the question is, well, if AI is going to be a big part of what they do in the future, maybe they should be learning it all along because they're going to be taking this out into their practice when it's widespread. So why would we deprive them? So we're still in the middle of that discussion. I think third and fourth years for sure, first and second years, open to debate. But I wanted to transition to the impression generation because when we first put in Omni, I had a very similar discussion with our current program director. And he said, no, I don't want our residents to use it. They got to be able to formulate an impression. And I thought that was reasonable at the time. Well, fast forward to actually literally just a couple months ago. And a few of the residents now have actually asked, hey, can we, we've been hearing a lot about this. Can we use it? I said, well, talk to the PD because, we haven't turned it on and he had some concerns. Well, he has now come around and said, well, I think we should allow at least our third and fourth years. And he's actually thinking about the first and second year. So as of actually last week, we actually turned it on for them. This is an evolving discussion. I can
Yeah.
see both sides of the equation, but I do think that these tools are going to be the future. And I've always told our residents, when you look for your first job, you should be looking for practices that are actively embracing tools like AI in their practice, because in a few short years, those practices that do not have it are going to be at a disadvantage. So if that really is the thought process, we should be teaching them how to use it now.
Yeah, I mean, Dr. Lee, I remember you telling me this was years ago about I would say the debate about whether or not to use templates in training. And gosh, fast forward now, I mean, who isn't trained on templates? And I think that obviously Jefferson Einstein's on the cutting edge here. It's exciting to hear that there are third and fourth years, potentially even first, who are going to be using RAD-AI impressions to generate an impression. I'll tell you, you said something at the end there, and I had a really provocative conversation with a radiology practice leader. And he told me that one of the most common questions as they have been interviewing people for open positions, and who doesn't have an open position right now, has been, what's your AI strategy? Right? Who would have thought, Dr. Lee, years ago, that that would be a question that people would be asking as they were having conversations about where they'd be employed?
Well, I can tell you in recruiting, there are candidates that actually ask, do you have impression generation? Do you have Omni? And
Wow.
do you have these other AI tools? So a lot of the candidates are actually seeing this.
That's really interesting, Dr. Lee. Well, I'm excited about what other AI tools will be brought to bear, how they will be impacting radiologists and ultimately the patients that everyone's trying to serve. And you mentioned it. Obviously, now we know that no radiologist is getting replaced, right? In fact, we need to find other ways in which we can support because there aren't enough radiologists to really service all of the demand that we're seeing across the country. I've heard you speak at numerous conferences. I think that you are an AI luminary and visionary. What are you thinking? Like, what do we need to do? What does AI need to do that's going to be the most beneficial to radiologists both now, but 5 years from now?
I think there's a couple of things. I still like to divide it into the sort of pixel-based or diagnostic AI and the sort of workflow and efficiency type AI that is not diagnostic. And I think both have absolutely a lot of value. The efficiency and the workflow-based AI, I think in the short term, have the ability to move the needle of changing our practice dramatically. And it's just a matter of adoption. Um, the efficiency I see, for example, impression generation, I always tell, I always check to see. So we do our call from home. And when I'm scheduled for a call, the first thing I check is make sure on my home workstation there was not some update that prevented impression generation not work. It occasionally happens. So from a mental effort, I can tell you it's huge. It's one of the things I look for. When you go back to the diagnostic and those pixel-based looking at fractures, PE, and intracranial hemorrhage, I think one of the things that we're seeing why the adoption hasn't been as quick is they're really single-serve models. So for example, I'm looking at a head CT, well, it's only looking for intracranial hemorrhage. If I'm lucky and we have it in ours, it may look for a midline shift. If we're really lucky, maybe it has aspect scoring that can help with scoring stroke. But there isn't any one all-encompassing that can do more than one or two things. And I think that is one of the things that will be, I think, transformative, if that's even a word. Once we have models that can actually read many diagnoses, and generative AI, I think, has that ability, or these new foundation models are coming up, that whole architecture will allow multiple things to be solved. And I think that will actually accelerate the adoption.
So we talked a little bit earlier about practices that may be less inclined to adopt and embrace AI. But we also talked about these, gosh, radiologists who are asking, hey, what's your AI strategy? And you even mentioned, Dr. Lee, that you've been encouraging people that you're training, hey, you need to be thinking about the practices and what they're doing and how they're using AI. How do we bridge that gap between innovative academic medical centers, innovative private radiology practices that are using AI and those that aren't? What would you tell a academic medical center or a private practice that wasn't using any AI at all? Where would you tell them to start, Dr. Lee?
Yeah, it can seem overwhelming at times. I think because now, I mean, we have over 1,000 FDA approved models in radiology.
Wow.
I mean, it's a lot. If it's not 1,000, it's close to that. So it can seem overwhelming at first. And I think one of the things that makes it easier is unless you're a large academic center and you may be developing a lot of these things in-house, a lot of the first thing you really have to do, assuming you're out in the marketplace and looking for a company to partner with, is ensuring that company is a trustworthy company or a company you can partner with. And I think that it sounds a little bit corny at times, but that can't be overstated because the relationship you have with that company is, to me, everything. And
Mm.
it's how, it's easy. Well, I wouldn't say easy, but it's one thing to install software into your system, and that can be difficult. It may have, depending on what you're trying to do, it may be a long process. It may be a little shorter process, but it's that relationship when something doesn't go right or when something is not installed correctly. That ongoing relationship to me is key. And so one of the things to get started, I think the most important thing is making sure you're choosing the correct partner.
Yeah, I mean, Dr. Lee, I think for me, I 1000% agree with that. I think it's one of the things that makes me most proud at Rad AI. It isn't when we're doing everything right. It's how we respond when we're flat-footed or when we made a mistake. That to me is what differentiates great partners from good ones. And I think that should really be kind of the North Star for every radiology vendor out there that's looking to be a good partner is that's not how you respond. It's not how you act when everything's great. It's what you do when it isn't, right? Because this is software, Dr. Lee. It never goes perfect right from the start.
No, absolutely. And you know what? I don't think, well, we're used to putting in a lot of sweat equity in, so we don't expect it to be perfect, but you're 100% right. It's how you react. And it's the same thing, when we get a complaint, our department's not perfect either. There's always something that happens, and it's how you respond to it and how you make it right to the patient. And I think patients appreciate that. And similarly, I think customers appreciate that.
Yeah. Dr. Lee, I debated whether or not I would ask you this, but I absolutely have to, even though year after year after year, Aunt Minnie in the awards always has burnout as one of the top news stories or the top most pressing issue. And those who aren't in radiology, or I actually won't name this health system executive, but I was talking to him about burnout amongst physicians and burnout amongst radiologists, and they seem to indicate, well, sometimes these things can be sensationalized, right? But you're in the trenches, Dr. Lee. You are the chair at Jefferson Einstein. Is burnout amongst radiologists, is this as serious as most of us think it is?
Yeah, I'm surprised to hear that there was an executive that would think that, but burnout is it's a huge issue. And it's one of the reasons why, I mean, there's the shortage of radiologists is multifactorial. But I can tell you during COVID, and immediately there were a lot of people that exited simply because, you know what? COVID is another thing to think about. I was thinking about retiring or leaving the workforce before maybe, but now it's a definite. And so when you have a shortage that's exacerbated by, for example, the pandemic, and you already had a shortage to begin with, what does that mean? Well, even if the volume stayed exactly the same across the country, and it didn't, you are going to be working harder. And so each radiologist in the United States, and I would argue across the world, even in the static volume, if volume didn't change, is already working hard. But you
Mm.
add to the fact that volumes are increasing every year. No matter what metric you're looking at, you can see volumes are increasing, but you're exacerbating that problem. And then you throw in that we're not training enough to even tackle the static volumes, and I think what is not unreasonably called a crisis. So I think burnout is a real problem because we're asking people to read more and more with the same that they had. You can see that every year I get the RVU data across the country, and you can see that the 50th percentile and the 60th percentile, that volume increases every single year.
Wow. Well, it's increasing every year, Dr. Lee?
Sure, it's just another way of looking at increasing volume. So when I say, just to clarify, when I say the 50th percentile, so if you look at the benchmarks, no matter what benchmark you use, if you look at what the 50th percentile radiologist reads, I'm just going to make up a number. Say it's 12,000 RVUs. I'm just making up a number.
Yeah.
Say in 2023, the 50th percentile radiologist, in other words, the median radiologist, say read 12,000 RVUs. Well, that same 50th percentile in 2023 from 2022 might now be 13,000
You
RVUs.
bet.
In other words, that median amount that the radiologist reads just goes up every year. It's just another way of saying that the volumes are increasing every year.
Yeah, and obviously, I think that the challenges that got us here are multifactorial. I think solving the problem is going to be multifactorial as well. There's not going to be one silver bullet. Do you see AI as a tool that can be assistive in solving the problem of burnout?
Absolutely. So on the one hand, you have the diagnostic AI, and I think right now it's hard to show that that can make a radiologist more productive because again, it only solves one question. So for example, if I'm looking at a head CT, it solves one question of say hemorrhage, but it's not looking at anything else. I think when these foundation models take off, and I think they're going to take off, when you can solve a whole bunch of problems and look at a whole bunch of pathologies all on one, I think that's when you're going to be able to see much better a turnaround time or efficiency gain potentially. On the other hand of the spectrum, when we look at the efficiency of the workflow models, for example, impression generation, I think that has a much easier way of showing that, hey, not only are we decreasing burnout, which I absolutely think is happening, and that's why I personally make sure it's on my workstation every single time when I'm on call, is that it decreased the amount of time that you spend working on a report. So the answer is absolutely yes. No matter what type of model we're looking at, assuming that it's doing its job and it's deployed correctly, and that's a really key question to answer. Is it being deployed correctly? And are we educating the users how to use it correctly? Then there's going to be absolute efficiency gains and ultimately help at this decrease in shortage.
Yeah, I'll tell you, Dr. Lee, one of the things that I was most happy coming out of RSNA last year is I had a radiologist who I really admired tell me that they would never practice without radii impressions, right? And I thought, gosh, that's a home run thing for someone to tell you, and you know that it's impactful and impacting them and ultimately impacting patients. And I can tell you, Dr. Lee, I think that's one of the reasons why our company made the decision based on feedback like that and based on feedback from radiologist leaders like yourself about the impact of rad impressions. It's one of the reasons why we moved into the full report, right? Because leveraging generative AI across not just the impression, but across many things within the report, we really see that as having an impact in both reducing burnout and allowing radiologists to keep up with that demand, but not at the expense of fatiguing them, Dr. Lee. So, any thoughts on the way in which generative AI will benefit more parts of the radiology report?
Oh, it's going to transform everything, I think. And it makes the transition from impressions to the whole reporting seems to be a natural progression. You're already looking at the whole report anyway. But I would see, back in the day, we already thought that impressions was a form of generative AI already. I mean, it's
Yeah.
creating new content. And so this is just another example of that taking a step further. So just like with everything else, I think in the radiology AI world, I think generative AI and the foundation model that we're now seeing on the diagnostic side, it's going to transform everything.
Yeah. Well, speaking of transformation, I think one of the things that you and I both would agree on is that having a mentor can be transformational on another human being. And so this is something that we really enjoy talking to Dr. Cook about. And I wanted to ask you, Dr. Lee, because you mentioned Dr. Madelon and the impact that he had at Jefferson Einstein in terms of really taking the organization to embrace innovation. What has mentorship meant to you in your career?
I think mentorship is everything. Mentorship and secondarily sponsorship, which is really mentorship, but also providing those opportunities for your mentees. I've been fortunate that I've had several outstanding mentors that affected my career. Dr. Madelon is absolutely one of them. But medicine is still an art as much
Mm.
as it is a science. It's still an art to much of what we do, and having those people guide you in the early and even in the mid stages is extremely important. In fact, it's one thing I pride our program on. It's something that we do at our faculty level and also at the resident level. I'm proud of the mentorship that we're able to provide our residents and that our program directors are able to provide, because these are going to be the next leaders of radiology. And I like to think that many of our trainees that come through our program will one day also be leading radiology.
Yeah, I've got no doubt in my mind about that, Dr. Lee. And one of the last questions that I want to ask you, and this is a loaded question, right? Anytime you have someone who's a chair of radiology or a leader like yourself, we all have challenges when you have a family, making sure that they get the attention that they need, that a lot of times because we spend so much time at work, the attention goes there. Any advice that you have? Anybody listening in, they're like, gosh, I heard Dr. Ryan Lee speak at a conference. I waited in line to ask him a question and I didn't get a chance because the next session went on. But if they were to come up to you and say, hey, Dr. Lee, any advice for you as I want to be a leader in radiology on how I can balance family and work life, what would it be?
Well, I traditionally told people that I was probably not the best person for work-life balance, and I have to constantly actually work at it. But if I had to say one thing, it's that your family is your co-pilot in everything that you do. And so
Hmm.
I remind myself that not only am I doing things for my family, but I'm doing things with my family to some degree. And that you have to have a good partnership with your spouse, your partner, and
Hmm.
also with your children as well, and to not forget that. And that's one of the things that I always remember. And I don't know that I'm the perfect at it, but I always have to remember what are the priorities in life.
Yeah. Well, I like that. I think co-pilot is, I hadn't heard it phrased that way, but I really like that, Dr. Lee. And I'll tell you, you have been so gracious to join us on the Imagine the Future podcast, Dr. Lee. I know that everyone at Rad AI is very proud that Jefferson Einstein was the first academic medical center to use Rad AI impressions. We're grateful for the way that you all have influenced how we think about being a great vendor and a great partner. And Dr. Lee, thank you so much for being our guest on the Imagine the Future podcast.
No, it's been a great collaboration. We're also very happy and very glad that we're partners. And thank you for having me, Josh.
Thanks, Dr. Lee.